Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is 4:35 p.m. in Singapore, and a very warm welcome to all our attendees to this webinar from Singapore and across the globe. So a very good afternoon if you are zooming in from other parts of the world, or a very good morning, as the case may be. We are delighted to see that interest for this webinar did cover a good geographical spread with sign-ups from our friends in ASEAN, Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. We also have interest from Australia and India, and we had several sign-ups too from the EU, Africa and Uzbekistan, and finally also a couple from the Middle East and the Caribbean. So we hope that we will be able to meet online with all these friends from around the world. There are about nearly 100 people, almost 100 people right now online. And so let's make a start. My name is Alvin Sim, and I'm the current Executive Director of the Singapore International Mediation Institute, or SIMI. SIMI was established in 2014 with the support of the Singapore government, and it aims to develop and uphold professional standards amongst mediators and in the mediation industry. Today, we are honored to have with us an experienced panel of professionals who are leaders of the Alliance of Organizations for Mediation Standards. The e-flyer for the webinar outlines what the speakers will share, but what I appeal to all of you all in the audience to bear in mind is this. Right, at the national, regional, and international level, how is our vocation, mediation, going to develop in the years ahead so that we are recognized as professionals who provide a high-quality dispute resolution service? And I think that is the crux of all that is going to be discussed this afternoon. So may I now invite our moderator for today's session, Mr. Claude Amar, who is zooming in from Europe, to begin the webinar. Claude, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Alvin. Good afternoon, good morning to all of you. It's an honor to be with you today on behalf of the Alliance of Organizations for Mediation Standards, which is a collaboration of 5 mediation certifying and or accreditation bodies from either Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Portugal, as well as Portuguese-speaking countries, and France and some French-speaking countries. The purpose of this alliance was and is to better organize the mediation industry and raise the mediators' professional standards by underlining the importance of professional skills and conduct of mediators. I am Claude Amar. I have an architectural and financial background, and I've been developing hotels throughout the world until my meeting 25 years ago with Bob Mnookin, Harvard Program on Negotiation Chair. He sent me to his friend Gary Friedman in San Francisco, where I received my mediation training. I'm now a full-time mediator, IMI and SIMI certified, and the founder of Mediation and Resolution, the first mediation chamber in continental Europe. I'm the president of IFCM, the French Institut for Mediator Certification, which is the French IMI's qualifying assessment program. I'm on the panel of several international mediation centers, including Equanim International, ICC in France. I'm on panels in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan, as well as a board member and secretary of the International Academy of Mediators. Businesses need and want a resolution rather than a court decision in commercial disputes. Mediation is a key process in this endeavor. We will discuss the importance of standards in supporting the mediation industry to reach these commercial goals, whether to build these professional standards from a baseline or take a top-down approach, as well as setting them against competencies, taking culture and context into consideration. I'm proud to be the moderator on this panel, and without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists who will elaborate on these and other issues meant to ensure quality in cross-border mediations. Professor Francis Law is the chairman of 8 international dispute resolution institutions in Asia Pacific and Europe. He has been practicing as a business negotiation consultant and dispute resolution expert in over 40 regions. Francis has an extensive experience in dispute resolution mechanism design and capacity building. He has trained over 8,000 professionals in disputes resolution and advocacy in the past 20 years. He was actively involved in the drafting of the Singapore Mediation Convention at UNCITRAL, and since 2021, he has been a representative of an accredited NGO with the World Trade Organization ministerial meetings. Francis will talk about the rise and nature of cross-border disputes, as well as mediation as an effective dispute resolution method in such dispute, should there be any doubt on that. Josephine Hadikusumo has been a lawyer for 24 years and a mediator and mediation trainer for 14 years with a focus on commercial matters. She is currently a partner on a firm in Malaysia and the director of the Asia Mediation Centre, as well as a board member of SIMI. She concentrates her mediation practice on commercial or corporate-related disputes, where she believes in empathy, curiosity, and a balance of structure and flexibility. Josephine's empathy is very important when it comes to highly emotional cases such as medical negligence and/or disability. Josephine will raise the issue of how standards can assure users of mediators' professionalism in cross-border mediation. She will also share what can go wrong if mediators do not practice using certain professional standards. Professor Joel Lee has played an important role in development of mediation in Singapore since the mid-1990s. He has taught and trained generations of practitioners in mediation and is a thought leader in mediation. His publications include an Asian perspective on mediation and the Singapore Mediation Handbook. He served as a member of the Singapore Ministry of Law's Working Group on International Commercial Mediation and as a founding chair of the board of the Singapore International Mediation Institute, which was instrumental in setting the strategic direction in professionalizing mediation through the development of a credentialing scheme for different tiers of mediators. In his free time, Joel teaches martial arts, which is quite a different form of alternative dispute resolution, isn't it? Joel will explain the process of setting safeguards through standards in the light of Article 5 of the Singapore Convention on Mediation. Ana Maria Mia Goncalves has been instrumental in shaping mediation within Portuguese-speaking countries, driving its development. She actively contributed to crafting Portugal's mediation laws and played a crucial role in introducing mediation courses in Portuguese universities. Ana also established quality criteria for private mediation practices in Brazil. With over 3 decades of international experience, Ana's expertise spans teaching, mediating, managing organization, and leading global businesses. She serves as a mediator on the United Nations Office of the Ombudsman Global Mediation Panel. Ana is a fellow of the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution and founded the Institut for Certification and Training of Lusophone Mediators, the ICFML. Many have characterized Ana as one of the most inquisitive individuals they've met, coupled with her innate ability to inspire and maintain a positive outlook. She will update us on the development of models of standards such as cross-recognition schemes, voluntary adoption of common standards, state-imposed or industry-led, etc., etc. Francis, the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Carl. Good day and good evening to all of our audience. It's a great pleasure to have the chance to share with you. Yeah, though in this week I've been to Singapore, and because of the important cases in Hong Kong, I fly back. Today I'm in Hong Kong to share with you about the importance of the standard on the mediation and the rise and nature of cross-border and mediation. It is an effective dispute resolution method. So we come to prepare the slide for you, and we will share from the first one to the second. First of all, we'll say that right now we do looking for a very effective way for our business. They are having to the one that we go for the first slide is. So that we'll be having a very important issue on how they can work out on different aspects together. One we are going for is providing a one-stop solution service for business. As a dispute resolution profession, we go further for the purpose of using our business strategy department, our deal making, and if that is have dispute, we do about the dispute resolution. That is important for us to understand all this kind of stuff. And for the first one, we look into is the more sophisticated dispute resolution process that we now have. First of all, we're looking for a very effective dispute resolution and risk management system that will provide in 4 categories. First, so we go to the second one. Yeah, the first is talking about that we have a very professional procedure for resolving disputes. It's a well-designed mechanism with rules and models. It will consider about the qualification and accreditation of the professionals involved. We have to set the standards and make a very good quality assurance system. For the dispute resolution, we go further for that is specialization. All this different kind of dispute deserve to be taken care of in a very specific way. Like we do have the ESG problems, we do have the construction problems, cross-border, about the finance and invest. They all have different characters. They will have different concerns and their interests as well. That is what in that maybe happen to be working like international, that is a sophisticated platform in the worldwide for which work out. And finally, is the integration among all professionals involving about mediation and involved about the arrangement for the arbitration and all dispute resolution process. But most importantly, get involved from the professionals, say other professionals in engineering, construction, and we do have a very important part that is involved in the say the business chamber and that workflow. We're looking forward is that the professional for working together is the dispute resolution professional, risk management professional, involving all stakeholders that go into. So we go to the next PPT, please. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the form we are going for is a professional way. So from the perspective of the parties. In the previous, most of our professionals will focus on the way how we see things, but most important at the present moment, as the demand for the business and the parties, we do have look into perspective of the business. We are providing the service to satisfy the need of parties going to a dispute. Our major concern will be focused on the business. They were looking for a very convenient and effective way of resolving the dispute that very close law, or they will minimize their loss in the whole process. Any way they can gain profit in the process of dispute resolution. They were concerned about how to preserve their reputation. That's important, or get extension of market. Finally, for the business, they were looking for any possibility and overall the value gain for the business. And that's what we looking for provide a service to satisfy these needs. So in the dispute resolution world, we're well familiar with that. Is talking about we have 4 very common use of dispute resolution. The most common use will be the negotiation, that all parties in dispute will try to resolve it by the first stage is to do with the negotiation. And then go further, we will go, if that is for the more international or cross-border, that will be talking about the DRR adopted by most people. Use the arbitration. The most effective one for the past 65 years, talking about with the New York Convention. What about mediation? It's the most effective and efficient dispute resolution. We'll go further on that because no matter the result, it's satisfying the parties' needs and concerns or the way they resolve it and the time and cost will be the most effective one. And definitely, we still have room for the litigation. That is the final and most authentic approach of resolving disputes. And in all countries, in trying to put into the final stage, that means they will try to use more friendly, more effective way to resolve. And then if they cannot finish the dispute, they will go to the litigation. It becomes the final resort. Okay, so the next slide, we'll see that. Under these circumstances, we will see mediation as really unique approach of dispute resolution. But as we have mentioned, the most effective dispute resolution procedure. And the second is different from any type of dispute resolution. Mediation, the decision maker in the process is not a professional. They are just business people, individuals. They don't know how to use it, how to make a good decision. So mediation become a very important process or procedure that facilitate our parties to make a right decision and educated decision which will lead them to the best interest and get the best result. Whole process is not the decision making by any other person, but by the party themselves. They don't know how to make the thinking. We have to develop them from logical thinking, from critical thinking, and then creative thinking on how to resolve it. And with the result, that will come with the best interest protection. And the third one is extra important. For other processes, we have a lot of limitation. But for mediation, we have a wide scope of application that will have the opportunity to provide the parties to great benefit and values. Let us understand that the basic principle is a synergy between parties. Understand, you have 2 minutes, thank you. And that will be create a lot of values through the collaboration between parties. And the other way cannot do. So another way, we will see there's a teamwork between all parties involved, involving the disputing parties, the mediators, the center, and also the case management, and with our advocates for doing that. You will see the key to the success of mediation involves all these 5 categories of parties. Parties themselves, professional mediators, we need someone to support them, individual, on thinking the strategy that the advocate do. And we have the convention, rules, and case management to ensure the quality control and assurance. Okay, next. And then we will see there's a proper procedure on finding out why there's a dispute and the psychology of the dispute. And if we use an adversarial dispute resolution approach, will bring to a very bad result. And then go for next slide, we'll see there's a proper model of mediation. How they can summarize the whole process and facilitate parties to make a very sound decision, to change their mindset of competition, to find the best result through collaborating with the other side. And we have the process to ensure the decision can be worked out and exercised through their work. And that is on the other one, you will see there's a proper procedures to ensure the whole routine is a very good way. Finally, we will see the enforcement part. So we have to separate 3 poles of using enforcement: the judiciary, the judgment, the arbitration, and mediation. Please be assured that we have to work out very clear. Individual method use appropriate specialization and works and professional is important. Go to the next slide, please. Then we will see that the settlement with the mediation, we have 4 different channels for them to exercise, enforce outside the original place. We go out abroad, overseas. That is different approach. Next slide, please. And then we will see we have a very good and very effective one. It will bring to a very effective one by first efficiency. Over 70% of settlement. It will be a final because party will be take all measures to work it out. We have 90% rate of performance. Resources is cost saving, resource saving. We have saved 90% of extra costs have to put it up. And finally, the value gain that will be very unique. People will have the extra gain through the process of an effective mediation and will gain much better than that. Next slide, please. To this, we will find that we need a very strong pattern of the quality control. We expect that with a high standard for all 4 group of parties. The professionals, mediator, mediation advocate, case manager, and also with the experts. Procedure very clear cut for different kind of natures of disputes. They have a clear procedure to tackle with the needs and concern of parties. We have the mediation institutions. They have to put out the rules and make the administration and for the quality assurance. And finally, we have the Singapore Convention, and the government ruling in support with a very high standard to make all it happen. Our colleagues will go further for the quality arrangement, the high standard in the next speech. That's my speech at the part. Well, another one is we expect a high demand for the future use in the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Greater Bay Area, an area of about 1.7 trillion US dollar GDP, and there will be a very high standard, high demand for the dispute over 300,000. We need 100,000 mediators, and then 10,000 certified mediators, so certificate advocates, and also 5,000 experts. We need all to come forward to support the growth of mediation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francis. That was very interesting. You told us that mediation was the most effective and efficient dispute resolution process, and obviously it gives the best solution to the parties in the fastest way. But could you share with us the secret of mediation? Would you agree with me that the magic of mediation is that the mediator has been trained to bring the parties back to the table and re-engage conversations?
Well, this is exactly what we are going to present clearly. Is that, thank you, Claude, that is the truth. So we have all the proceeding we have suggest is a very well-trained and very sophisticated mechanism in helping parties to resolve, to make a new thinking on their disputes. So a well-trained with popular licensing mediator, copying with the whole rules and regulation from the organization will be the must for making that success for the mediation.
Thank you very much, Francis. Our next panelist is Josephine. You also have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Claude. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all our participants from all over the world. I am delighted to be joining you today to be speaking on a very favorite subject of mine, which is mediation, and in particular, mediation standards. Before we begin, I think it's very important to designate, to classify exactly what we mean by standards. So standards, what are they? I like to categorize them in 3 ways. The first way is to define them as an acceptable level of qualification and professionalism of a mediator. That is, what constitutes a mediator? Okay, what standards make you a mediator? What makes you a qualified mediator? So that's one element of standards that we're looking at. The second element of standards I like to look at is really an acceptable code of conduct governing the process and quality of a mediation. In other words, what constitutes a proper mediation? And the third way of looking at it is a specific approach or style to mediation, which differs from center to center or culture to culture. And in other words, can these different styles still constitute a common standard? And with that, let's go on to our first slide. The good news is that standards abound. Okay, every center and country has them. They are found in legislation, in codes of conduct and practice, in regulations for each organization, even in court rules governing court-mandated mediations. Every center accrediting mediators has their own standards. The bad news is that there is not one single global universal standard that every mediator or user can refer to as the gold standard. We simply do not have that common principle which defines what constitutes a mediator and what a mediation should look like. Next slide. That is not to say that there have not been discussions around the creation of a global standard, but this has been mostly a controversial ask because centers and countries tend to be very attached to their own standards, which are informed by different approaches to mediation based on culture, styles, and legal setting. Practitioners and scholars have even mooted the idea of a code of disclosure in order to provide clarity of procedure before a mediation takes place. But a code of disclosure would then set out broad principles on what kind of rules the mediation will adopt, as well as elements such as independence, impartiality, confidentiality, process steps, etc. So thus far, such an idea has received endorsement from various organizations, but it's still a long way from being accepted as the gold standard for mediation. We still don't have that. And it certainly doesn't address the issue of quality and standards for what makes a mediator. So let's move on to the third slide. There are issues with regards to that. There are certainly disadvantages. So what are some of the disadvantages to not having a global standard for mediation? Although we do not have the exact percentages on hand, anecdotally, many of the users of mediation are first-timers. They would need to be educated on the process and expectations of mediation as a whole and informed what standards are being used in their particular instances. And not having a universally accepted standard lends itself to some uncertainty for first-time users due to the variance in standards for mediation. In cross-border mediations, where the users and mediators may be from completely different jurisdictions and cultures and legal setting, there is the added challenge of aligning on what are the actual standards to be used. Which ones will prevail? How would the user know whether this mediator is of an equivalent standard to another mediator when the qualifying pathways are so diverse? Now, this is particularly relevant in the case of co-mediations, where two different mediators from two different cultures, ascribing to two different sets of standards, are sitting in the same mediation. Whose standards should be used? How do I know the mediator is qualified the way I am? How would the end user know? So these differing standards and the lack of having a global standard is what contributes to a lot of problem. And with that, let me share a personal story. I was in a co-mediation with another mediator who was a former judge. And my expectation at the time was that we would all understand what are the tenets of mediation, how a mediation ought to be conducted, and what are the expectations when it comes to managing the parties. But right in the middle of the mediation, my co-mediator started to use very strong language, talking about something that was clearly showing a bias towards one party. Very strong language showing a bias towards one party. And as we all know who are in mediation, this violates the whole concept of neutrality, which is one of the basic pillars of mediation. And I could not stop her from going on. And I remember I had to take some unconventional action to stop her. I kicked her under the table. So she stopped talking for a minute, and I immediately jumped in and tried to salvage the mediation. But that was an actual real life situation of what happens when you don't have a standardized standard or an expectation are different as to what makes a mediator and what are some of the codes of conduct a mediator should abide by. And fundamentally, a lack of a universal set of standards potentially leads to mismatched expectations between the parties and the mediator, which is not an impossible problem to navigate, but certainly requires extra effort to align on expectations. Slide 4, please. There is an assumption, of course, of the presence of standards as a minimum requirement. In Article 5.1e and F of the Singapore Convention on Mediation text, the keywords are applicable mediator standards, and this provides some flexibility in the reading to include any standards related to mediation. The language in the text seems to suggest that there is no need for a universal global standard on mediation, provided that fundamental elements like impartiality and confidentiality and ethical considerations are taken into account. It suggests that some standards are sufficient, some standards are expected, but how long is a piece of string? So next slide. Thus far, nearly all mediation organizations have mooted different rules, some more restrictive and others more general, but nearly all of them contain some common elements such as self-determination, neutrality, conflict of interest, confidentiality, and competence. This means that at a minimum, users can expect these to prevail in any mediation, and mediators are held to account, but there is still a great deal of variance on the qualifying pathways for mediators, and this can be confusing for the end user. So the question for mediation organizations now is this: in the absence of a universal code, what are some of the ways in which mediation organizations can align on standards for the benefit of end users? One example in which we have done so is through the setting up of a Mediation Standards Alliance, such as the one that we have set up between SIMI, AMC, IDRRMI, ICFML, and IFCM, called the Alliance of Organizations for Mediation Standards. Within the alliance, members review the standards of each individual body and come to an agreement on equivalencies of standards so that there's a sense of commonality in the framework governing these standards. As more organizations join the alliance, more of these alignments can take place so that there is an expectation that a qualified mediator within the alliance network will have approximately the same degree of competence and standards as another mediator within the alliance. This does not replace the universal standard, which may be a dream too elusive to chase at the moment, but it does increase standardization of standards across a broader spectrum of organizations, which will ultimately benefit the end user. And I've come to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Josephine. It seems that you feel, like me, that the only way the end user can be assured of quality standards is to have a universal or global standards for the professionalism of mediators. It seems you have given us the recipe for the necessary cocktail for providing such quality assurance to the business community. And the cocktail is, the recipe is code of disclosure, common standards, certification. Would you agree with me that we should make sure that training is mandatory?
Absolutely. There are some organizations that have something called experience pathway qualification, where they take, where they don't make it mandatory for people to go through training, particularly if they fall within a certain category of experienced users. But for our organization and our alliance, we believe that training is mandatory, not only training, but there should be a testing element. Mediators should pass a particular exam to basically assure competence so that the end user can benefit from this. And then there's an assurance for the end user of a quality mediation and a mediator that is professional.
Am I right believing that your co-mediator, the retired judge, didn't have a mediation training?
I was not aware of her training background, but I was very much taken aback by what had happened. And that was not the only experience I had where there was a clash of standards expected, and which resulted in a very chaotic mediation session, more chaotic than it needed to be, which I think that a common standard or some equivalency would have made the problems much easier to handle. But it was a very interesting mediation. I kicked her very hard under the table, and I don't think she has forgiven me to this day.
Thank you very much, Josephine.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Joel, you're next, and you're not afforded more than 10 minutes.
Thank you, Claude. I think that's your way of telling me to shut up at the right moments, and I think I will do my best. I'll do my best to comply. As usual, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, from wherever you are, whatever is appropriate. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. What I would like to share with you in the next 10 minutes covers a little bit, overlaps a little bit with what Josephine has said, but I hope to take it in a slightly different direction. I hope we all don't expect that, like, in the course of this 1 hour, 1.5 hours we are together, we're going to be able to solve the problem of universal standards. I'm afraid that's not going to happen. I think greater minds than ours have actually turned their attention to this, and I think it's a constant work in progress. Okay, so what I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes really is to share some potential challenges, some potential parameters that we can use to think about. So whenever we talk about setting standards, it always seems like a very good idea. It just sounds like a good idea. And there's only really one problem. And I think that this problem is best illustrated by the next slide. So the next slide, please. I'll give you a moment to just take this in. Right. So everybody thinks it's kind of like a nice idea to have universal standards. There are way too many standards. And this applies to anything, to be charges and code, pretty much any human endeavor, okay, including martial arts, including mediation, any skill. And so then somebody sets out to do the universal standard, the ultimate solution to the ultimate problem. And then all of a sudden you have 15 competing standards, or 17 or whatever is plus one. Right, and just because this is a challenge doesn't mean we shouldn't sort of make some effort to work at it. But it's just sort of highlighting the scope of the problem, right? So why standards? Why is this all so important? I think all of us can intuitively say yes, it's important. But let's sort of boil it down to what I would suggest to you: two things. Next slide, please. As a movement, I think mediation is tending now towards being a separate profession of its own. Now, in some jurisdictions, some of our friends already consider that it is a profession, and that's fine. But in many other jurisdictions, it's still considered, sort of like something that we do on the side, something that is a great idea. People don't really get paid that much for it. So the world isn't all on the same level about this. And I think with the Singapore Convention on Mediation, the fact is that there is now this very steady march that's picking up momentum towards professionalization. Okay, and I'll say some things about that in a moment. But the other reason why standards is important, particularly after the Singapore Convention on Mediation, is Article 5 of the Singapore Convention on Mediation. Josephine has mentioned this a little bit. I'll go over the text of it in a short while. Next slide, please. So turning first to why standards, because of the need for professionalization. As with most professions, there are parameters by which we determine how somebody gets into the profession, how somebody acts in the profession, and how somebody stays or departs from that profession, right? So if we wanted to consider mediation at some point a full profession, there must be a clear, recognizable route for entry, right? And we could say, well, we have that right now. Anybody could hang out their shingle as a mediator in many jurisdictions. Sure, isn't that a route for entry? Well, that's less of a route of entry than the fact that there's a wide open space and anyone can just sit down and so claim something. The route of entry must actually be connected to the notion of recognizing one's credentials. Having credentials, having something that people recognize, maybe not universally, but that people recognize as providing that minimum entry level. Yeah. The process must also allow for progress, either your ongoing development or your personal and professional advancement. And finally, there must be a mechanism for ensuring quality. And what I mean by that is reaccreditation. Are you, for example, ongoing skills? Do you qualify to reaccredit yourself, be requalified, and so on and so forth? Now, the reaccreditation point is a little bit challenging because sometimes once you're called, you're called. But in some cases, you may need to renew your qualifications every year. And then the mechanism for ensuring quality is that the complaints, right? The idea that if there's a grievance, we need to somehow be able to address it in a meaningful way. Okay, so that's sort of a quick tour de force of professionalization in relation to the question why standards. Let's now turn to why standards, specifically Article 5. Next slide, please. Right, so I won't read this out to you, right? But that's Article 5.1e, and there's of course more to the text of the SCM, as we all know. But the key thing that I want to focus on is 5.1e, where we say there is a serious breach by the mediator of standards applicable to the mediator of the mediation, right? And this is one of the bases upon which a party can refuse registration or enforcement under the convention, right? So essentially, of course, if two parties are happy, it's fine. But if one party is trying to register and the other party is saying, not going to let you do that, I'm going to resist you. One of the bases is to say, well, hang on, that's because the mediator breached applicable mediation standards. Now, again, it sounds fine and well, but the obvious question to all of us must surely be, well, hang on, what standards? What standards are we really, really talking about, right? And there are a number of points, reference points, which is non-comprehensive, so please don't get me wrong, by which we can measure whether somebody has breached mediated standards, right? One of which is actually the standards of the country in which the enforcement is sought. So, for example, if registration is being sought in Singapore, the Singapore courts could actually look at the standards of Singapore, whatever those are, right, depending on how we define what that is, to determine whether there's been a breach. If it was being sought to be enforced in France, for example, and I realize France is not a signatory, but let's just say, then what we're saying is then, what does France see as their standards? Okay, and they may have a standards body there, they may have mediation organizations that will step up and say, well, we think this is the standard, right? The second reference point is standards as specified by the agreement to mediate. So, for example, if I was a mediator and I engaged both parties, or both parties engaged me, we have a mediation agreement, an agreement to mediate, where we will state very clearly that, you know, the quality or the level of which this is determined by these particular standards. We can specify that. The standards as set up by the Taiwanese Mediation Centre, whatever. I don't even know if that exists, but it's essentially of a particular body, okay, or a particular country or a particular institution. It could also be indicated by standards as indicated by the mediator. So the mediator says, well, actually, you're bound by the standards I hold myself to, and it is these things. And this is linked to the next point, which is standards applicable to the mediator by virtue of their training, credentials, and accreditation. All right. Okay. And then finally, you could say standards as established by independent standards bodies. Okay. And these are different from mediation service providers. So let me be clear about that. The idea generally is institutes like IMI or SIMI, of which I'm chair, don't provide mediation service. We don't provide mediation trainings. We set the standards, we credential, and the idea is that we are a part of the mediation industry, but apart from the mediation industry. Yeah. Okay. So these are a number of different ways we can think about how to answer this question: by whose standards? Again, not comprehensive. Again, there may be a little bit. We could look at other things, for example, but for the moment, at least, it gives us a sense of what the potential problems can be. Next slide, please. What are some of the challenges that we face? And this will be the last slide before I end. Well, I think we don't normally use the same terms when we talk about what is standard. Is it a baseline by which it denotes a minimum standard so that we can enter the profession? Or are we talking about an aspirational point? So some people say, oh, let's establish gold standards or platinum standards or whatever, diamond standards. But here's the challenge, right? Just because you're establishing diamond standards, which is an aspirational, very high thing, doesn't actually mean that somebody who has met the baseline is not a good and competent mediator and is somehow, not able to resolve disputes. So when I think we talk about standards, at one level for our purpose, like Article 51E, we must be talking about baselines. Right? Then the second challenge is that we sometimes throw around words like standards, competencies, benchmarks, right? And technically, they mean similar things, but not exactly the same thing. So, for example, one way of thinking about it is standards set overarching expectations. Competencies break down those expectations into specific skills, a little bit more granular. And benchmarks provide checkpoints for tracking progress moving towards those expectations, right? So if we are talking about expectations, standards, then we say, well, then what is the minimal expectation we expect of a competent mediator, right? If we're going to measure it in terms of competencies, then we say a competent mediator must demonstrate these things. Right? And we say benchmarks, well, the competent mediator must have reached these things in their behavior, for example, having mediated a number of cases and so on and so forth. Last point on this slide, which is can we come up with universal standards versus culture and context? I think that's a challenge. Josephine has shared with us a list, I think, of about 5 or 6 things like confidentiality, neutrality, so on and so forth. Even something like neutrality isn't shared by all jurisdictions, right? Confidentiality, yes, right? Agency, self-determination, yes, right? But whether we believe in agency self-determination, does that affect, for example, the so-called facilitative evaluative divide? For example, some jurisdictions do not do private session. And if I was an international mediator and I didn't know that, and I did a private session and somehow breached that culture, that context rules, have I breached mediator standards? Right. So it can become a lot more granular than just that. Okay. But I hope this session has given us a little bit of a sense of how complex this question might be and how the challenges ahead. And I know that my colleague Anna, my friend and colleague Anna, will be discussing some of this in more detail. So I'll leave this to her to bring it up. Claude, am I making it a good time? Are you going to score
Thanks
me?
very much, Joel. Yeah, you only are a few seconds late. Thank you very much for establishing that when we talk about standards, we talk about baselines. The same applies to training. All of us have received a training, and with the years, we have developed our own personality, and sometimes we go overboard vis-a-vis the training we have received. But that's for the best. So we want to share baseline. I'm curious to know, Joel, is if today we can already measure the impact of the Singapore Convention on the international business community. Do you have any data you want to share with us, or it's too soon to ask that?
No, I think, I personally don't have any data. That's not to say the data isn't out there. For example, the SIDRA, the Singapore International Dispute Resolution Academy, does yearly surveys on mediation and arbitration. So they may have a little bit more data. But I think anecdotally, and this is anecdotal, so please take that for what it's worth, there is a lot of excitement about this, certainly business professionals, right? And if you take a look at the number of mediation organizations, service providers, institutes, standards bodies that are being set up internationally, you look at the number of countries that are signing, number of countries that are looking at mediation acts of their own, I think it is safe to say that there has been a very a positive impact in that direction, but no data specifically, I'm sorry.
Just to answer the question you asked in the beginning of your presentation, France is thinking about signing the convention. When, I cannot tell you now, but it's in the process. As the Universal Disclosure Protocol for Mediation is an international project, could you provide us with some insights into how it was initiated and has evolved over time?
Again, I feel very, very sorry to Claude that every question I say, I'm going to tell you that no, I don't have insight into that. The person actually that was one of the prime mover, is the prime mover, is actually Anna, as you well know. I do know that the conversation has been around for a little while, and the idea being that rather than we say, okay, we're tied to a particular standard or not, that a mediator makes a particular disclosure. But I could not tell you how long that conversation has been going on.
Thank you very much, Joel. Before giving the floor to Anna, I'd like to make some housekeeping. Unfortunately, I have to leave this session before the end to catch a plane back to real life and to end my vacation. So I will leave you by the end of Anna's presentation. Please accept my apology, and Joel Lee will step in as the moderator in my place. It was very nice being with you. Thank you very much for your attention. Anna, the floor is yours.
So, dear dispute resolvers and other colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you are all doing well. And we had the chance already to listen to a couple of fascinating sessions today. And I always say I'm blessed to be here, always learning with my colleagues. It is a pleasure to always to speak about this topic that is mediation. And I'm going today to speak about ensuring certainty, credibility, and interoperability in cross-border mediation. Standard or framework, that's the question. And I'm going to speak about important work being undertaken via the Universal Protocol to increase professionalism in cross-border mediation, mainly to create more certainty, more credibility, and more interoperability. Next slide, please. So for several years, I have been saying that mediation is like this. Mediation today offers a kaleidoscopic landscape with huge varieties of practice, and there is no common core of the practice that are universally applied worldwide. I often cite J. Folder, who wrote, "The absence of regulation allowed the flowers to bloom." And also we have seen this during the intervention of Josephine with the examples she brings to us. Next slide, please. And this also has been the conclusion of the survey of more than 60 countries around the world, done in a book called The Variegated Landscape of Mediation, a comparative study of mediation, regulation, and practice in Europe and the world. And in the forewords of that book, Manon Sonville and Jeremy Lack state, and I quote, "It is difficult to extract any clear standards of process for mediation when two parties come from different jurisdictions, especially when the expectations, styles, approach to mediation vary greatly from country to country." Next slide, please. So we must face an inconvenient truth. On one side, we have the concept of standards as a formula that describes the best way of doing things. That is how the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, describes standards, a prescription on how to manage a process, how to deliver a service. And on the other side, we have flexibility, we have self-determination as essential success factor of the cross-border mediation. And so, as revealed in 2022 by the survey that is regularly done by Singapore International Dispute Resolution Academy, in this survey, these two features were viewed as absolutely crucial or important factors influencing 80% of users' choice of mediation. So if you want to understand a little bit further how norming has been being done in dispute resolution, we need to understand the difference between framing standards for executive processes and framing standards, protocols, frameworks for auto-compositive process. Let's look at this. Next slide, please. And so, on one hand, an adjudicative process, as you all know, I'm sure, rely on an external authority to make a decision. The rule-based norms are standards, rely on law, on precedent, on procedure rules, and on rights and due processes. Next slide, please. Norming an auto-compositive process as cross-border mediation is a very different story. And so an auto-compositive process empowers the parties to shape the resolution process of their dispute according to their needs and their preferences. And we know that self-determination is the one principle that mediators agree worldwide. So in this case, the needs of the party must stay at the center of what we can call the norming process. It must be party-centric and must respect confidentiality, informality, and adaptability. Next slide, please. So this is our challenge in cross-border mediation. How are we going to create a frame that will bring more certainty to the parties about the process, about the approaches used by the mediator, while at the same time strengthening the platform for enforceability of the cross-border mediation settlement agreements created under the Singapore Convention on Mediation. And let's remember what the academic studies say about incredible variety of mediation types, modes, and models around the world. Parties who are experienced in mediation will likely expect to be able to use a process based on their experience. For those with no experience with mediation, there is likely to be a lot of anxiety and expectation. And at the end of a cross-border mediation, in case of agreement, we need to have something that we call the standard for that specific mediation. The standard that allows that mediation and that agreement and that settlement to be possible. So the question now is, how do we do that? And this is the question we were facing in 2019. Next slide, please. We cannot solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we use when we create them. So we were inspired in our reflection by this quote of Albert Einstein. And the temptation to use top-down approaches was high. But as I have shared with you before, that should be reserved to the executive process. An auto-compositive process requires something else. Next slide, please. For more than 4 years, discussion between academics, practitioners, international mediation stakeholders shows that the meta framework norming the disclosure by the mediator while respecting the diversity of practice was a good solution. We decided not to try having a unique international standard for mediation because first, it will be impossible, as Joel and Josephine just stated it. And do you imagine each mediation institute saying quickly yes for a global international code of conduct? And second, it would probably kill some funding principles of mediation. So we decide to norm the disclosure by the mediator, and by doing this, to influence the standardization of the practice. This is a second order kind of norming. From there, you see the word meta. So the commitment of the mediator can be explained with this sentence: as a mediator committed to upholding mediation principles of self-determination, transparency, respect for cultural influence, and flexibility, I will ensure that I discuss the list of elements for disclosure and any pertinent option topics with the parties during the intake and mediation process. And what is this list of elements disclosure of GDPM? Next slide, please. The 6 elements are conflict of interest, confidentiality, general process, role of the mediator and parties, technology, impact of them. So independently of which country the mediator comes from, of the countries or the parties from, or the mediation cultures they have been exposed to, or the legal framework, the first thing the mediation commits to with the parties and their respective representatives is to discuss these 6 elements and to come to an agreement. We create more certainty and more professional image of mediation by having this conversation. And also this is in accordance with the ancestral mediation notes of 2021. So, of course, from the moment this framework is used, it opens possibility to discuss again those elements during the mediation itself, if any party needs it. But it helps norming while keeping the flexibility. Next slide, please. Where are we at? As of today, the Alliance of Mediators for Universal Disclosure Protocol has a strong momentum. Mediate.com, the large US-based mediators platform, ODA Latin America, Africa Network, and ICFML for the Portuguese-speaking countries are all supporting the protocol. Recently, we got a new organization supporting the protocol, that is Mundi Mediators. Mundi Mediators is the new worldwide matching service to assist commercial parties in designating the most appropriate dispute resolution process for their case that will be officially launched on 30 January 2024. Mundi Mediators supports the UDPM as an important recent contribution to the field. You can see other endorsements here listed on the slide, and we will also have 180 individual mediators who have endorsed the protocol. The more we speak about, the more people tell us it makes sense. It is something that has potential to be changing the professional in the mediation field. Next slide, please. To finalize, how can we go further? To be adopted even more globally, VDPM needs further recognition and users from all stakeholders concerned by the development of cross-border mediation. You can see them there: professional organizations representing parties, professional organization of mediators, lawyers and judges, public entities interested in regulation, promoting the mediation, multinational companies, individual contributors. When I discuss and I share these topics, I am passionate about this, as you can see, topics which I really believe can have an impact. When I discuss this with my Singaporean friends, they often ask me, so Anna, what do you need? How can I help? And I am always very positively impressed by how Singaporeans generally give insights, information, contacts that are very helpful. So I have lived in almost every continent in the world, and I see this as a unique Singaporean trait. Next slide, please. So now is the time to increase the momentum. And if you believe in the value of DPM, and if you have access to high-level decision makers in relevant stakeholders organizations, or if you are one of these stakeholders yourself, please contact me. Please, let's ensure together higher certainty, credibility, and professionalism in cross-border mediation. I thank you, Alvin, SIMI, and Joel for inviting me. I thank you, all of you, for listening to me. And I just finished my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Before I take a look at some of the questions that are on the. Oh, by the way, everybody, if you haven't figured out already, I'm not Claude, or maybe I've just gotten a little bit darker and a little bit shorter. And so as many of you know, Claude had to leave with his apologies, but I'm stepping in for the moment. So Anna, I think the question that Claude posed to me a little bit earlier, which was how long has this discussion been going on, and I'd like to add a little bit more. How did the people who talked about this thing, about the protocol, the disclosure protocol, come to the conclusion that it was these 6 elements, as opposed to some other set of elements, some other number? So perhaps you could help us with that.
It was not easy. That's the first thing. We have work groups from all the continents, from Africa, from Australia, from here, from really international. And the thing that we have this starting question: what is crucial in providing certainty to the parties while preserving the flexibility of mediation? That was our basic question. And so we understood that parties often lack clarity of what to expect. Also, we understood from our discussions that often the mediation process starts even before the formal mediation starts itself. And so we start thinking about how to give the correct level of certainty to this party. And we have more than 25 ideas of what to speak about, and then to arrive to something that is feasible, to something that can be implemented. We just get that these 6 elements that are confidentiality, conflict of interest, role of mediator and the parties, general process, speak about technology, and speak about the impact of venue, will give certainty and will have all the ingredients to be used if needed when applied the Singapore Convention. And so that's how it was a long and a brainstorming process that arrives here. And more we test these 6 elements, more we don't see that something is missing. So that gives us more assurance on our conclusions until now.
Great. Thank you very much. I do have a follow-up question, but maybe we'll do that as part of the larger group. So if I could ask the organizers, please, to turn on the panelists' cameras. And my hope is that as I'm going through some of the questions, I'm going to direct it to a particular person, just really to kick us off. My hope is that everyone else can, if they have a view, can jump in and make this a conversation more than a straight question answer. And I hope that that's okay. I think first let me thank the number of questions that have already come in, by 10 to 11 questions. And I think let me pose the first question to Josephine. And this comes from Samantha. So Samantha, my apologies. I'm going to actually rephrase your question a little bit so that it's something that's easier to pose to Josephine. But I think the whole idea here is that can we really say that it's sensible that we can somehow standardize mediation? Isn't this sort of contrary to the idea of the flexibility of mediation? How do you even quantify and standardize something like emotions especially when mediators are supposed to be able to deal with emotions in emotionally charged conflict? So I've obviously left out some bits and pieces from the questions, but I think that's kind of the direction we're moving. Is this sort of like just a checklist, right? Or are we saying that there's something that's far more nuanced than that? And Josephine, maybe you could start and the rest of us would have a view, could jump in.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question. I've always believed, in my personal approach to mediation, there needs to be a combination of flexibility and structure. And what do I mean by that? In every mediation, we're expected to be process managers, problem solvers, and people managers. So in the context of principles of mediation, like neutrality, like confidentiality, ethics, those are things that we should be inflexible about, that we should have some form of structure over. That is the framework and the basis by which every mediation should be conducted. But within the context of managing parties, managing emotions, knowing when to speak, what to say, when to pause, when to give space, when to hold space, there is a great degree of flexibility for the mediator to be able to conduct this mediation. So that is part of your people management skills. It's part of how you manage expectations of the parties. And there's a great degree of freedom in how you want to manage that. So yes and no, there is a checklist in my mind. The checklist has to do with fundamental pillars of what makes a mediation successful. But the secret sauce comes down to the personality and the freedom of the mediator and your wisdom in how you choose to approach the parties and the problems at hand and how you choose to drive the problem-solving vehicle. So I hope that answers your question. But any other thoughts from the panel?
Anna, Francis, Alvin?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I totally agree with Josephine. That's exactly the process is talking about, not only for the path to use to handle the dispute, but talking about how to handle their emotion, their concerns, and also that psychological situation. And finally, we would expect that there will be a way to facilitate the overall collaboration between the parties and the professionals, working out with the best result for all the stakeholders. So that's why I think maintaining this basic understanding could lead to a very effective mediation about the criteria, how to make it work, and why the standard is important.
Thank you, Francis. Anna, Alvin, anything to add? If not, I'll since Francis is actually on the screen, I will actually ask him the next question. Nothing? Okay. So Francis, there's a question from Kok Eng, who has been a very strong mediation advocate in Singapore for many years, and a very experienced mediator. And so his questions is really about global standards, but global standards, a common global mediation training standard. And he's wondering, well, in a sense, is that possible? How feasible it is, and whether that will actually help towards the establishment of internationalization and professionalization. So Francis, would welcome your views on that.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Well, I think there's this all the expectation if we can actually have a global standard about the training to promote that, and that is the basic reason why we formally at the beginning we set up this alliance organization for mediation standard. And I would be appreciated that it would be our collaborative work in setting the standard for the training. But one thing is important, because from different culture or practice, the application of mediation will have a different. So that the training standard will be based on the characteristic of different region, their nature of dispute, and also with that for their cultural issues. But I think the alliance organization are working well in formulate a more, we say that is a kind of a way that we can make up a system that work for different region with a probably that will be able to provide with what we say that is the expected standard. Not completely the same, but have the same standard arrangement with that.
Great. Thanks, Francis. Anna, Josephine, Alvin, would you like to? Yep, Alvin, please.
Yeah, I think it is a good idea to work towards a global training standard from this perspective that once you get everybody involved in mediation training to talk the same language, that would, I think, inform the public, potential users that the profession has reached a certain understanding or maturity that this is what a mediator must be made up of. Training syllabus in terms of this area, that area, and so on. So that would, I think, increase the professionalism of mediators. And that's the starting point. And the question is, how do we bring all the major players together, given that they are spread across the world, have different views and so on? Thanks.
I'd like to jump in to say that this having a global one standard training is aspirational. I think it's as aspirational as having a universal code for all and standards for mediators. It is something we should aim towards, but given the diversity in the culture and the legal settings, in the styles and approaches to mediation, it would be quite challenging to come to a landing point where all the major players would have consensus on the syllabus that is to be taught. It doesn't mean that we stop aiming for it. I just think that at this point in time, it is aspirational and something we should work towards, but how long it takes to get there is another question altogether.
It's interesting because when I listened to you, I was saying that despite the training that has been done, that despite the training that the mediator follow, if you have a clear certification process, with clear criteria. That's what we have done in this alliance, and that we apply them. We are seeing the results. We are looking at the result. We are looking at what this mediator is going to do when he's going to be in front of his or her clients. So for me, more than a universal or aspirational training syllabus is really a set of criteria of certification that allow the mediators to go to any mediation they want, to go to all the other not mediation training, but depending on their practice, they go to more family trainings, they go to more commercial trainings, and then come to a certification that looks at the basic behaviors that we believe are the minimum that we want mediators to have in front of clients. So for me, the question would be more that one, and that one I believe it's much more feasible. And this is the reality. We managed to do it. So yeah, that was my thinking about this question.
Yeah, no, and just my 2 cents worth, just from my background in teaching and training. I think there's a commonality. We could have a discussion about syllabus and what at its bare minimum needs to be in the syllabus. Right. I don't think we need to be that sort of evaluative or directorial or directive about how it needs to be taught. Do we do it one way or the other, or strategically when a mediator chooses to do this or another? But for example, I would be very troubled indeed if any training course did not produce a mediator that understood the mediation process, the role of the mediator, the values associated with mediation, self-determination, confidentiality, and so on and so forth, right? So I think the danger is getting into such a bare minimum that's hardly useful at all. And the challenge is overcoming, so everyone's need to try to get it down to granular detail, tie it down so certainly, because then you will never get there, right? So work in progress, as we say in Singapore, akan datang, it's coming. I think Malaysia says that also, so we didn't steal it from you guys, we share it. I'd like to, there are 2 questions that I particularly like to have a look at, but let me first pose a question to Anna. And this is a sort of a merger of two questions. One is from Jorge Pascuato. I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but the question I think is, there are currently codes of conduct, right, by various different organizations. It can be the Singapore International Mediation Centre, whatever, doesn't matter, right? But these code of conducts, how do codes of conduct fit in with standards in the way that we're having this discussion? So Anna, that's kind of like the first part of it. And the second part of it comes from Kian Yip, who's also a senior mediator in Singapore, where he references your slide 39 about the protocol. Disclosure protocol covers what, according to UNCITRAL's Mediation Notes 2021. And I think his question is whether you expect Alliance members to adopt UDPM as well to strengthen mediation standards. So it's a little bit like mediation standards, and how does it really relate to the UDPM? How does it really relate to codes of conduct? Does that help, Anna? Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question, because that was exactly how all our discussion started. It was exactly, the French said, oh, but I have my code of conduct. And look, this confidentiality means this. And then we have the Australian that said, I have my national standards, look. And when we discussed in this discussion about what each one of these people coming from different countries, from different cultures, even not discussing about what was in the side the code of conduct, but what were their understanding of what was written. The same word, you could have like 20 different ideas about why that was in that code of conduct. So the question is not only have the same code of conduct, is that among culture have the same understanding of what is written there. So then 2 of the mediators go together and they understand that. So we find that very difficult. we did not get any understanding common about a lot of words that are in most of the code of conducts today. So to answer the question, how code of conducts fit into standards, it fits very well on the standards of one country, where, you know, the mediators go to those standards and they understand them. The problem we are here speaking today, it's about when they are crossing with 2 or more countries. And there is where there is a role for interpretation. That's why we arrived to this framework where you can put inside all the codes you want. The thing is that you explain to the client, and the client understands what is going to happen in that specific mediation related to whatever code of conduct you decide to choose for that mediation. So this is for, I think, answering the first part of your question, Joel. For the second part of the question, the conversations continue, and we just, like Josephine said, let's suppose that tomorrow we have a global gold standard for everybody. The question is that it is very rigid. And so we arrived to the conclusion that flexibility, that is one of and we saw on the CIDRA survey, flexibility could be lost. So clients would not come. So we just take that out of our discussions too. That was not our goal. But we start like that. We start by saying, how can we put only one standard, and let's go and speak about that. And we very quick arrived to the conclusion that that was not the right way to go. So today we can see the more and more clients say, I don't know what mediation is in international. So I continue with my arbitration. It's clear. It's clear. I don't want to go to this mediation thing that I don't know very well how it is. I don't know what the mediator is going to do. So when I discuss with some judges that practice arbitration, and probably Francis, you can speak about that also, is that arbitration starts with this preliminary arbitration hearing, where it's clear what is going to happen after. This first arbitration meeting is really not about the substance, but about the procedure. And so it's kind of the same idea that we have for mediation. We are not going to speak about the content of the dispute. We are going to set the framework that allows us to work together on the substance later. I hope that I answer your question.
Thank you, Anna. I see that we are very, very close to 6 p.m., but with the participants' indulgence, there is actually one question that I think I would be very interested in getting panelists' views on. So if we could quickly maybe address that question, and then I'll let Elvin close the session with some administrative matters. This question comes from Athena Stafila. I apologize again for mispronouncing. And the question is open to the entire panel. It's about whether the requirement for neutrality, it may not actually be useful to people who are practicing things like evaluative mediation or transformative mediation, maybe even narrative mediation. And that this whole notion of neutrality is really part of a story that's spun by facilitative mediators, right? So I know, Joe, you were interested in that, and I know, I don't know if you have a firm view about that, but would you like to kick us off? You're muted.
I thought that was a very interesting question, because for me, I've always assumed neutrality to be one of the basic tenets, the basic pillars of what makes mediation a mediation. And that does not take into account of different styles of mediation in which neutrality will not be as important. for the life of me, I cannot picture a mediation where neutrality would not be as important, because what neutrality basically means is the mediator is not biased towards either party. So whether you adopt a more evaluative or facilitative style, you still need to be neutral. You still can't go and have an interest in the outcome either way. So I think that the neutrality basically is something that transcends all other kinds of mediation styles, in my personal opinion, that is.
Okay. Thank you, Josephine. Anna, Francis, Alvin, anything you'd like to add to the mix?
Yes, thank you, Joe. I think that neutrality, as Josephine highly highlighted for example, is not about the style, it's the basic. For the dispute resolution, if you are, no matter mediation or other type, if you are not neutral, you have a bias on each or any party, it could become not fair. And for mediation in particular, because the decision is made by the party themselves, so it's definitely if the mediator have their bias, their own thinking will have undue influence to the party, and they will finally find that they may not accept even they have come up with a settlement. They will find regret later on. And it's very sufficient point for building the trust between the mediator and all parties. So neutrality, I think I just cannot find out any situation whereby mediation is conducted without neutrality. This major concern. Again, as what we have mentioned very clearly, when we look into mediation service, we have to separate that from other type of dispute resolution approach because they're totally different. We'll try not to use other approach in comparison with mediation. That is quite not fair, and that will not making mediation work really effective.
Thank you, Francis. I think maybe part of the challenge might be we might mean different things when we say neutrality.
Yeah.
Right. And so when we say neutral, we mean a very specific thing that applies to all mediation. And perhaps Athena has a different point. But I don't think we can explore that at the moment. Anna, Alvin, an opportunity for last words. Anna, you fine? Alvin, on this topic?
Yeah, I just say emotional, social, cognitive. It's something that is difficult to put neutral with these three words. So, and also I agree with you, Joel. We even don't know what was the idea of neutrality that was on the question. So we are answering, assuming about our own idea of neutrality. So this is so very difficult to go on this short time on that one.
Okay. Well, I'm very mindful about time, and I want to be respectful of our participants' times. So let me thank all our panelists for their contributions, their sharing. It's much appreciated and very insightful. I'd like to thank all of those all of you for attending, but at the same time for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't address all of them, but this is one of the hazards of a webinar. And so let me pass the space over to Alvin to make some closing sort of announcements.
So thank you very much, Prof Joel. It's actually my privilege to just say thank you to you and to Anna, Josephine, Francis, and Claude for being on this panel and making this conversation possible. And we hope indeed that these conversations will continue at different levels between institutions, between mediators, and that at some time we will converge, right, with regards to where we go with regards to this very relatively nascent yet critical issue about standards in the mediation profession. Because, as I said, it's all about really how are we going to develop as a profession. More importantly, a recognized and trusted profession that is able to provide a high quality dispute resolution service, right, as individual professionals. So it remains for me, yes, to just record my thanks to all the panelists and thank you very much for those who are online for staying with us on this Friday afternoon.